Bring in the jury.
Please stand for the jury.
Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. The defense may call the next witness.
Please, Judge, defense calls Ms. Alice LaViolette.
Please come forward right up here to be sworn. Right up here.
Raise your right hand. You do solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Please walk right around here and have a seat.
Did you want some water? If you want to, you can pour some now.
Thank you.
Maybe the other cup, though.
What's that?
A clean cup.
Oh, a clean cup. Oh, all right. Never mind. All right.
I'm just going to do the same thing. All right, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Could you tell us your name, please?
My name is Alice LaViolette.
And Ms. LaViolette, what do you do for a living?
I'm a psychotherapist. I do consulting and training, and I do expert witness occasionally.
Okay. And so, psychotherapy and what?
Psychotherapy, I have a private practice.
Okay.
And I have a specialty in domestic violence. I conduct 2 groups a week for men who perpetrate domestic violence, and I have a broad-based private practice where I do marriage counseling. I also do work with individuals. I work with adults. I work with battered women. I work with adult survivors of childhood abuse. And then I do a broad-based private practice with a variety of issues.
Okay, let's talk about your education. So what I want to know is what qualifies you to do this type of work. So can we talk about your education for a second?
Yes, I went for 2 years here in Arizona at Glendale Community College. The first year at the campus that we used to call Reed Mullin Ford University, because it was right next to Reed Mullin Ford, and then the actual campus was sort of the campus that's there now was built for the second year. And I went to become a teacher. I got interested in psychology and then went over to Cal State Long Beach and did my bachelor's degree in clinical psychology. About 8 years later, I went back and did my master's degree in community clinical psychology, and then sat for the licensing exam. I had to do 3,000 clinical hours that were supervised, and then I sat for the licensing exam and became licensed in the state of California.
All right, so let's talk about your undergraduate degree first. So you said you finished up at Cal State North Beach?
Cal State Long Beach.
Long Beach.
Uh-huh.
I didn't go there. So, all right, so you finished up, is that where you get your bachelor's?
That's where I got my bachelor's.
And you were talking about becoming interested in psychology?
Yes.
Okay. And so what is your bachelor's in?
My bachelor's is in clinical psychology, and my master's is in community clinical psychology.
Okay. What's the difference between a bachelor's and a master's degree?
About 2 years. I completed my master's in 2 years. It can sometimes take 3, but I actually did it in about 1.5 to 2 years.
All right. And your master's, you said, is in community clinical psychology?
Yes.
What does that mean?
Community clinical psychology is a program at Cal State Long Beach that was kind of unique. You were interviewed by faculty and students who had been through the program, and you had to pass. Well, actually, they had to select from the applicants 12 people who would be part of this program. And back at the time, the reason I wanted to do this program was because it was hands-on. You actually got to go out in the field and work 20 hours a week doing field work, and that's what I wanted to do.
When you say field work, what does that mean?
you could pick a practicum, a place to work that had to be approved by your department. And so at that time, I did 10 hours in a community facility, a community like neighborhood kind of facility, where I was doing tutoring and registering voters and that sort of thing. And then I did 10 hours a week in the battered women's shelter, which I didn't really know anything about, and was wanting to work in some form of impacting violence against women, since I had known people who had been raped and sexually assaulted. And so I was going to work with sexual assault, and one of my friends was volunteering at the shelter and told me that it was a very interesting place to work, and it was a very new field. So I decided that I would apply there, and I volunteered there 10 hours a week.
When you volunteer when you're working on your master's and in that particular community clinical psychology, and you're volunteering at a battered women's shelter, what is it that you're doing there?
Well, you're doing a lot of different things. I worked on the hotline. I was trained to work on the hotline, so I worked on the hotline.
And what's a hotline?
The hotline is a 24-hour crisis line where people can call anonymously, or they can give you their name, and they can tell you, they can talk to you about what's going on in their lives, and your job is to listen to them, sometimes make referrals, sometimes recommend that they come into the shelter, that sort of thing. And in addition to that, I did clerical kinds of work. I did fundraising for the shelter. I did what was called casual counseling with the women, which is you just sat with the women and the kids in the shelter and talked to them or ran a group. I did a self-defense class for them one time because I'd taken one self-defense class and I wasn't very good. But it was fun for the women to be up and moving around and doing physical things. So.
And can we talk timeline? When in the timeline of your life are we talking about? What year is this?
1978. 1978.
1978 is when you started with your master's?
1978 is when I started with my master's. 1980 is when I completed my master's. And I volunteered at the shelter until 1979, and then I was hired in 1979.
Okay. And when you were hired at the shelter in 1979, what were you hired to do?
I was hired to start a program for men who battered their wives. And the reason for that was that we did a little piece of research on women who had been in our shelter. The shelter opened in 1977. And we did a little piece of research to find out what happened to women after they had left the shelter, a year after they left the shelter. And of the women that we could find, over 80% had returned to the person who abused them within the first year after they left. And so our director was very farsighted, and she said, we need to start a program for the men who are in relationship to the women in our shelters so they go back, so the women and children go back to a safer place. And actually, I didn't want to do that. Nobody actually at the shelter wanted to do that, but I needed a paid position. I had 2 children, and I needed a job.
Why did you ultimately take the job then? Well, let me ask you this. Why didn't you want to take the job of starting a men's group?
Because I'd worked with the women and the children, and it was really hard to see what had happened to them, and so I didn't initially want to do that, but I began to do it. I began to develop the program because I liked, program development. And then when I started the work, I really liked the work, and I stayed with it.
And when you talk about working at the shelter and starting to work on this men's group, are you also still going to school with your master's?
Yes, I'm still going to school with my master's.
All right. And to get your master's, are you taking classes as well?
I'm taking classes. I had a graduate seminar that met 3 hours a week and a supervision group that met 3, and then I had taken a lot of my classes prior to actually getting into the program. They could count classes I'd taken between my bachelor's degree and my master's degree.
Okay. And so at the time that you're now working at the shelter and you're working on starting this men's group, is there also something that you have to do to finish up your master's?
Yes, I had to do a thesis. After I completed my classwork, I did a thesis.
What does that mean? What does that mean?
You write basically a research paper, and it's a significant research paper on a topic that your clinical supervisor approves and that is something that would be of interest. And I did mine on perpetrators of domestic violence. And it was one of the early theses on that topic, because at that time I had sort of a corner on the market. I had there were only 2 programs in Los Angeles County that actually dealt with working with folks who perpetrated violence. And so I had clients who volunteered to participate in that study.
Okay, and when you talk about clients, are you talking about the men, the perpetrators?
Yes, the men who were in my group.
Okay, and that's the group that you were that you created.
Yes.
And what was the purpose of that group?
The purpose of that group was to teach people skills and maybe help them to work on issues that would enable them to be more effective parents, to be more effective partners in their relationships. And at the time, I hadn't had much counseling experience. And so I sort of based my group on a healthy family. What would a healthy family look like? And I talked to the women at the shelter, because at that time I think there were 3 groups around the country that were doing this work. And I wrote to all of those groups and got information about what they were doing. And they were all doing work at about 6 to 12 weeks. They were doing short-term work. And I talked to the women in the shelter, and what was consistent from those women was that the men they were involved with had grown up in abusive families and needed help, that they needed to be, to have work on trauma issues. And so we created the group to deal also with some of those trauma issues.
And so this group that you created, that you worked with, was it just men who would be in this group?
Yes, in the state of California now, you have to have same-sex groups. At that time, you didn't, but we didn't have any referrals from women at that time.
Okay. And so how long did you keep working with this particular group? Well, you received your master's in 1980, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. When you receive your master's, let me back up a second. When you receive your master's, you said you have to write a thesis.
Yes.
Is that right? Do you have to do anything with that thesis?
You have to have it approved, and you have to sit for orals. So you sit with a group that questions you on your thesis and has to approve your thesis and feel that it's worthy of, if it's to be published. I don't believe mine was published. I think parts of it might have been used, but I never pursued publishing my thesis. I was just happy to get through with it, actually.
All right. So once you receive your master's, that was, you said, in 1980?
Yes.
Okay. And then are you still then at the shelter working in the men's group?
I'm still at the shelter, and I'm working with the men's group, but I'm also doing volunteer recruiting and training, and I'm doing all the community education for the group. So, for instance, I worked with the probation officers locally, and we set up the first 8-hour training program for probation officers on domestic violence in LA County, and then went around the state. And I worked with 2 probation officers on that. I did training for mental health. Initially, really, in 1979, the only people that kind of wanted training were church groups. And I went to United Methodist Women, I remember, were one of the first groups that supported the shelter. And I would go to speak to their church women's groups. I went to speak to the Seroptimist. I went to speak to the Rotary. I went to speak to mental health agencies. So anybody actually who wanted to hear about it. And by the way, at conferences, we would have maybe 3 people in a workshop. People really didn't want to hear too much about it then. Well,
I was going to ask you, in the late 70s when this is occurring, was domestic violence something that was wide known?
No, it wasn't. There were very few shelters. Shelters began to open in the late 70s and early 80s in the United States.
And you said you were one of 3 groups in the U.S. who had a men's group? Is that right?
There were 3 other programs that were outside groups. There was one program in Washington State that was at a veterans hospital, and they had a residential program there that Ann Ganley did.
I'm sorry, that who?
Ann Ganley.
Okay. Is that somebody who's involved in domestic violence, battered women? Or?
Yes, she's involved with battered women, but also involved in doing programs for the men.
Okay. And so when you're doing how did you feel working with these men?
I guess that I felt I felt hesitant at first, but I quickly saw that they were in pain and that they, for some of them, really wanted to change. Some of them didn't. They just wanted to get their partners back. And so the men that I worked with who continued to stay in group because they had an option back then about staying in group really seemed to want to change. And I was excited about that. I thought that was terrific. And I wanted to be part of that process. And by the way, I worked with a male co-facilitator. We wanted to set it up to look like, as much a family as we could. And so I thought having a male-female team would be a good way to go with that. And having that power dynamic where you see respectful interaction between a man and a woman would be good role modeling in that group. So we did a lot of that. And I worked with him for 28 years until he retired.
Your
My co-facilitator, yeah.
Did any of these men you had started working with just the women in 1978, is that right?
Right.
Did any of these men ever frighten you when you started working with the perpetrators?
Objection, relevance.
Goes to her expertise, Judge.
Overall. Occasionally. I have been frightened probably 3 or 4 times in my career. If I was frightened very much, I wouldn't keep doing it. Because it would be too frightening. So there were several times where I really worried. One time with a guy that was a gangbanger who was someone who I know had murdered people.
And when you talk about the 3 or 4 times, how many men have you counseled throughout your career? At ballpark.
Well, probably a couple of thousand, but I'm not sure. There maybe less than that. I've done two groups a week for 34 years, and I've had normally not more than 12 people in a group, usually somewhere between 8 and 10 people in a group. And the groups change so that it's an open-ended group and people can come in at different times during the period of doing that group.
All right, so from going from the first men's group, what kind of therapy do you do now?
I do very broad-based therapy. I've worked with couples, high-conflict couples, people who need anger management. I work with adult survivors of childhood abuse. I continue to do that. I work with battered women. I continue to do that. I've worked with a few men who have been abused as well. I continue to do the groups. And I work with adolescents. And occasionally I'm working with parents on parenting issues.
And when you're doing this work, do you work always with groups, or do you sometimes work with just an individual?
I work with individuals. I work with couples. I work with, I haven't worked with large families, but I've worked with, like I'm working with a grandmother and her granddaughter now, and who has custody of her granddaughter and that kind of thing.
All right. So after you, how long did you stay working at the shelter with the men's group?
I worked at the shelter from 1978 till 1984.
Okay. And all that time from 79 to 84, was that where you were working with the men's group?
I worked with the men's group from 79 to 84, but I also worked with the women, and I also did community education, and I also recruited volunteers and trained them.
Okay, so you were doing a myriad of things.
Yes, I was.
All right. And in 1984, what did you move to?
In 1984, the funding collapsed for the shelter, and I needed a job, and I thought that it might be a really good idea to try to start my own business, which was something I'd never actually considered in my life before. And I had 2 children, and so I needed.
Sustained.
Oh,
Did you start your own? Did you start your own practice?
yes, I did. I started my own practice in 1984.
All right. And what kind of practice was that?
It was a psychotherapy practice, but I continued to do training. The probation department hired me for probably, I think I worked for the probation department on and off for about a decade, doing training for probation officers and people in camps for working with domestic violence.
So did you do volunteer work then along with your private practice?
Yes, I continue to do volunteer work.
All right. The volunteer work, did you actually work for the probation department, or was that volunteer work?
No, they paid me to do that.
Oh, okay.
They paid me to do training.
All right.
I mean, I volunteered time talking with the probation department, but when I trained their officers, that was actually a paid position.
Okay. And what did they pay you to do? You said train their officers. Train them to do what?
Trained them to identify and work with people who were arrested for domestic violence.
Okay. And what about, and then with your volunteer work, did you do trainings with your volunteer work?
Yes, I continue to do training. I do training for shelters. I've done training for lots of people who requested it. I continue and have done training for churches. A number of churches have had issues where they've talked about domestic violence in their congregations, and they need to have some way to deal with that or to deal with anger, so I've done that. I do training, most of the volunteer, although I'm on the alumni board at Cal State Long Beach, and so I do, I've reviewed grants for them and done a little bit. We're starting to meet with younger people and do some mentoring. I do that. I am a reviewer. I'm on the editorial board of a peer-reviewed journal, and I do peer reviews, and that's volunteer.
What peer review journal is that?
Journal of Child Custody.
Okay. Do you ever work in child custody issues?
I do. I consult usually with people when there are child custody issues. I have come in and done expert witness or consulting with child custody evaluators or with attorneys in domestic violence cases, and counseled battered women generally, and occasionally also I've worked with fathers who are going through domestic violence issues and working with them.
All right. And all this training that you do at churches and different areas, what kind of training is it? Is it all different kinds of training, or what are you training people to do?
It depends on the group. When I do training at churches, a lot of times it's to explain why battered women stay. It's to look at gender issues with domestic violence. Sometimes there are counselors out of the churches that want training on doing anger management. There are several groups, church groups, where they had a big enough congregation and they had people that wanted to be peer trained to do anger management groups. So I've done that. It really depends on the group and what they want. I've worked in almost every area of domestic violence. I did training on teen dating violence, and that was volunteer in the high schools. And I've spoken in the high schools in California, around in Long Beach and different areas, and done that as a volunteer. And that would be coming out and talking to kids about dating violence, teen dating violence, and what that looks like, and resources that they might have, and that kind of thing.
All right. And besides training, do you do speaking engagements?
Yes.
What kind of speaking engagements do you do?
I speak at conferences. I do keynote addresses. I've spoken for educational groups. I've keynoted for therapy groups. The California Association of Marriage Family Therapists, I keynoted for their conference. I've keynoted I keynote for the fatherhood. I've keynoted or done workshops at the Fatherhood Conference on a parenting curriculum that I helped develop.
What's the Fatherhood Conference?
The Fatherhood Conference is put on by Children's Institute International, and Herschel Swinger, who has passed away, was the founder of that conference. And it's really to encourage fathers to be the best fathers they can be, and for at-risk dads, fathers who've grown up in gangs or fathers who have, have not been the best fathers, to really improve their fathering. And there are a lot of men who are very interested in that and come to those conferences.
All right. And besides that speaking engagement, have you been asked to speak outside the United States?
Yes, I've spoken in a number of countries. I've spoken in Japan, Israel, New Zealand, Ireland, Canada, and then I've done some work for the State Department of the United States, and those are video conferences. I just did one in Kathmandu, Nepal. I didn't go to Kathmandu, but I did a video conference there, in Cape Verde in Africa, and in Tel Aviv.
And these speaking engagements, what is it that you're asked to speak about, generally speaking?
I'm asked to speak about setting up domestic violence legislation, community organizing around development of battered women's shelters and programs that are more holistic, that address the entire family. For the most part, that's it. There are countries where people are just developing things, although Israel is quite sophisticated. And when I go to these countries, I sometimes speak to the governmental groups on the creation of laws, because I have done some work on legislation as well.
On the what?
On legislation.
Oh, legislation. Okay. And you said you've done work with the Department of the State?
Yes.
And for the U.S. government?
Yes.
What is it that you do?
Those are the video conferences that I've done. I was asked to go to Sri Lanka and Maldives, and I was asked to go to Africa, but there was a very limited window of time, and I couldn't fit it into my schedule, and so I wasn't able to actually travel, so the video conferences were set up.
So when you're speaking to these other countries, is it the U.S. government that is asking you to speak to them?
Yes.
Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Okay.
Through the State Department and the embassies.
Okay. Okay. And how long has that been going on? Has that been going on through different presidencies?
During George Bush's presidency and Barack Obama's presidency.
All right. What about, you said you did some work with the LA County Probation Department. Have you done any further work with them?
Just in terms of talking to probation officers about clients, but I haven't done training for them. I think, I'm trying to remember the last time I keynoted the State Probation Conference, and that's about the last time. I also did a speaking engagement for female probation officers that had a specialized group, and I did training for that group.
A specialized group of what?
Just female probation officers.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay. Did you ever help to create any programs with the county department, the probation department?
Did I create programs?
Yeah, so like design any type of domestic violence training?
Well, yes. With in 1980 in California, we created a diversion law, and people were diverted from the system and sent to counseling. And so that was where I worked with the diversion officer and the supervisor of the adult probation department to develop the training for officers to be able to deal with this influx of new clients on this new issue.
All right. What about awards? Have you ever received any awards in the area of domestic violence or in that area?
Yes, I've received a number of awards. I've been very fortunate. I just received an award from the shelter that I worked at just this past year. It was called a Champion of Hope Award. I've received a Lifetime Achievement Award. I've received proclamations from the county and the state. And I've received from the Seroptimist and other groups awards.
Okay. And we've been mentioning California a lot. Is that where you currently live?
I live in California. I've lived in California since I moved there in '67.
All right. And were you originally from Arizona? You said you went to Glendale Community College to begin with?
I moved to Arizona when I was 10, I moved from New Jersey to Arizona. I went to Sunny Slope High School, and I come back from my high school reunions and still have friends back here.
All right. But other than that, your business and everything is in California?
My business is in California, yes.
Okay. And so when you're talking about helping to develop different probation trainings and things like that, that's why we're talking about Los Angeles County?
Yes, and the state of California.
State
yes.
of California. Okay. Do you have any published works? Have you published anything in this area?
I have a book called It Could Happen to Anyone, Why Battered Women Stay. It's coming out in its 3rd edition in April. I have articles that I've written for the journal Child Custody, I have a chapter in a book called Domestic Violence Offenders. I have...
Let me ask you, the chapter in the book called Domestic Violence Offenders, what is it that you're writing about?
It's called A View from the Trenches, and it's about, it's sort of a 25-year retrospective. I can't remember. It was 2002, I think it came out. And it was a retrospective on batters intervention programs and looking at what we currently know and what we knew and some of the things we look at to measure success in programs and some of the things we want to have happen in those programs.
Okay. And the book that you said that you wrote about why battered women stay?
Yes.
Is that what it's about?
Yeah, it's about why battered women stay.
All right. And when did you first write that? Do you remember?
The first edition was in 1993, and it became a bestseller for Sage Publications. And so they asked us to write a second edition, which we wrote in 2000, and then they asked us to write a 3rd edition. And my co-author and I are old enough that we don't believe a 4th edition is going to happen.
All right. With regard to that particular book, how is it that you sit down to write a book like that? Is it based on research? What do you do to have that information available to you?
My co-author is a researcher. I was not a researcher. My co-author would bring me piles of research, basically, piles of articles, and I would have to read them and write them up in a way that could be understood. And we use case studies in the book. We made the book something that we hoped that folks could read who were victims and perpetrators of domestic violence as well, but also people who are just interested. It's used as a textbook currently in a number of universities back east. I was just a couple years ago speaking in Hawaii, and somebody from a small island near Sri Lanka came up to me and said that they used the book there. So I have no idea who else using it, but we feel pretty good about it because people have liked it. And we've also we've had attorneys who have used it in their cases.
Okay. And clearly you're here testifying, so do you do forensic work as well?
Yes, I started doing forensic work in 1984. I was asked by an attorney to explain why a battered woman would kill and why she stayed. My first trial in 1984 was a domestic violence homicide trial. And at that time, the battered women's testimony was not considered. It really wasn't well thought of or well respected. And so I didn't testify in that case. I consulted in that case. But I know that I didn't even know that this was a job. I thought it was a volunteer position. And when she asked me to do it, I said, certainly I'd be happy to do it. And I said, I'm assuming it's a volunteer position. And she said, no, you get paid to do it. And so I was surprised.
All right. And since that time, do you know about how many cases you've worked on forensically?
I've worked on about 60 cases forensically. I don't do a lot of forensic work. I do usually about 2 cases, sometimes 3 cases in a year, depending on whether I'm consulting.
Why don't you do a lot of forensic work?
Because it's very difficult for me sometimes to watch the process.
Objection, relevance.
Sustained.
Do you have your own practice as well?
My private practice?
Yes.
Yes, I do.
So besides coming here to testify, do you also have a private practice that you're running?
I hope so when I get back.
Okay. What types of cases, the forensic, we're talking about the forensic cases that you've worked on. What types of cases have you worked on?
I've worked on homicide cases. I've worked on a stalking case, a kidnapping case. I've worked on child custody cases. Most of the cases I've done currently are child custody cases.
Let me stop you there. When you talk about child custody cases, is that a criminal case?
No, it's not.
Okay,
It's
so
a family law case.
okay, so
So family law cases, I've done 2 civil cases, 1 federal case, 1 post-conviction case.
okay, and of the criminal law cases that you've done, about who retains you? Do you have an idea who you work for more often, the defense or the prosecution?
I've worked for the defense about 16 times, 15 times, something like that. I've worked for the prosecution about 9 times, and I've done some prosecution work that I don't even think I have on my CV, where I've just consulted with the DA's office. I've done 3 consultations for the district attorney in Los Angeles County, and I've just volunteered. I've done that, and I do volunteer mock trial for the district attorney so they can practice with an expert witness, and I do that. I've done that twice now.
So you help the prosecutors in California get experience at cross-examining an expert like yourself?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And do you have a particular criteria that you use before you'll decide to accept a case?
Approach.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to take the evening recess at this time. Please be back in the designated area at 10:30 tomorrow morning, 10:30. Please remember the admonition. Have a nice evening. You are excused.
Please stand for the jury.
The record will show the jury has left the courtroom. Counsel, anything else for today?
No, Your Honor.
You may step down.